I never imagined that silence could be so loud. It started as a feeling I couldn't explain, like something important had already happened and I was the last person to know. That kind of feeling sits heavy in your chest. It doesn't scream. It waits, and the longer you ignore it, the heavier it becomes. For years, I pushed that feeling down and told myself I was imagining things. I told myself that family doesn't lie to you. Family doesn't plan against you. Family doesn't smile while deciding your future without you in the room. I was wrong. My name is Yannefer, and before you hear anything else about money or wills or betrayal, you need to understand who I was before all of that. I wasn't greedy. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even suspicious at first. I was loyal to a fault. I believed in keeping the peace. I believed that staying quiet was a form of strength. I believed that if you were patient long enough, people would eventually do the right thing. That belief almost cost me everything. Growing up, I learned early how to make myself small. Not because anyone told me directly to disappear, but because disappearing made things easier. When adults talked, I listened. When decisions were made, I accepted them. When my opinions weren't asked for, I swallowed them. I became very good at reading rooms, sensing moods, knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. In my family, silence was rewarded. Questions were not. From the outside, we look like a normal family, stable, respectable, the kind of family neighbors smiled at and said nice things about. Inside, everything was controlled by a few loud voices, and everyone else learned how to adapt around them. I wasn't the favorite. I wasn't the rebel either. I was just there, reliable, convenient, easy to overlook. Except for one person. My grandmother was the only one who noticed when I stopped talking. She was the only one who noticed when I left the room quietly instead of arguing. She never interrupted me. She never rushed me. When she asked a question, she waited for the answer. Even if it took time, sitting next to her felt different. Like I didn't have to perform or explain myself. I could just exist. She used to say very little, but when she did speak, it mattered. Her words were slow, deliberate. Like she had already thought through every possible outcome before opening her mouth. Sometimes she would just look at me with this knowing expression, and it made me uncomfortable. Like she could see thoughts I hadn't even admitted to myself yet. I didn't realize then that she was watching everything. Family gatherings were always the same: loud laughter, forced jokes, conversations that felt rehearsed. Money came up more often than I noticed at the time. Investments, property, plans for the future. Who was doing well? Who deserved what? I listened without reacting, telling myself it wasn't my place to care. Whenever inheritance was mentioned, my name never entered the conversation. Not even by accident. At first, I didn't mind. I told myself I didn't need anything. I told myself I would make my own way. But over time, I started to notice patterns that didn't sit right with me. Documents being passed around quietly. Phone calls that stopped when I entered the room. Conversations that shifted tone the moment I asked a simple question. When I finally did ask, the answer came quickly. Oh, there's nothing for you to worry about. It's already handled. You don't need to be involved. The words were calm, but the way they were said felt rehearsed, like everyone had agreed on the script long before I showed up. I remember nodding, smiling, pretending I understood. Inside, something tightened. I didn't know what it was yet, but it didn't feel like trust. I went to my grandmother that night and sat beside her like I always did. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't even ask directly. I just said, sometimes I feel like people decide things for me without telling me. She didn't respond right away. She kept looking straight ahead, hands folded, breathing steady. Then she said, people will always decide things in their favor if you let them. I asked her if that was a bad thing. She said, it depends on who is deciding and who is paying the price. Those words stayed with me longer than I expected. As time passed, the message from my family became clearer. I was not part of the future they were planning. They didn't say it cruelly. They said it kindly, almost gently, as if they were doing me a favor. They told me not to expect anything. They told me to focus on my own life. They told me money changes people and it was better not to think about it. Eventually, I believed them. I struggled quietly. I worked harder than I should have. I accepted less than I deserved because I thought that was just my role. When things got difficult, I didn't ask for help. I didn't want to be a burden. I didn't want to be accused of wanting something I wasn't entitled to. Meanwhile, I noticed that everyone else seemed very comfortable, very secure, very confident about the future. Whenever my grandmother's name came up, the room would shift. It was subtle, but it was there. Voices lowered. People exchanged looks. Someone would change the subject. I asked once about her will, just out of curiosity, and the reaction was immediate. That's private. She has everything sorted. She trusts us. The way they said us made it clear I wasn't included. I told myself I was being dramatic. I told myself I was reading too much into things. That's what happens when you've been trained not to trust your own instincts. You second-guess yourself until that feels safer than truth. Then everything changed. The day my grandmother passed away didn't feel real at first. There was no dramatic moment, no long goodbye, just a sudden absence that made the house feel hollow. People moved quickly that day. Too quickly. Calls were made. Papers were gathered. Plans were formed. No one asked me to sit with them. No one asked what she had meant to me. I was told again that everything would be handled. I remember standing in the hallway, listening to muffled voices through closed doors, and realizing that I wasn't grieving the same way they were. I was sad, yes, but I was also uneasy because grief usually slows people down. It makes them pause. It makes them reflect. What I saw was urgency. That's when the feeling returned. The heavy one, the one I had ignored for years. Something was happening without me. The days after were a blur. People were polite, but distant. Conversations felt tense. I was kept out of meetings, out of discussions, out of decisions. Every time I asked what was happening, I was told to wait. Then my phone rang. I almost didn't answer it. It was an unfamiliar number, and I was tired of conversations that went nowhere. But something made me pick up. The voice on the other end was calm, professional. He asked if I was Yannefer. He said he was calling regarding my grandmother's estate. My heart started racing before he even finished the sentence. He asked if I could come in to speak with him, alone. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed after the call ended, staring at the wall, replaying his words over and over. No one had mentioned a lawyer to me. No one had said my name in the same sentence as estate. When I arrived at the office, everything felt unreal. The room was quiet, too quiet. There was an envelope on the table with my name written on it in handwriting I recognized immediately. My grandmother's. My hands shook as I touched it. The lawyer looked at me and said, "Your grandmother was very clear about what she wanted." He paused before continuing, like he was watching my reaction carefully. "She wanted you protected." I felt something crack inside me then, not in a painful way, in a releasing way. Like a truth that had been waiting for the right moment to surface. He began to explain things slowly, carefully, making sure I understood every word. My grandmother had planned ahead. She had updated her will years ago. Quietly, privately, she had documented conversations, decisions, patterns. She had seen what I hadn't been ready to admit. She had left me everything, not a portion, not a share. Everything. The number didn't register at first. It didn't feel real. Money had never been part of my identity, but the meaning behind it hit me hard. This wasn't about wealth. This was about trust, about recognition, about being seen. She believed you would be pressured, the lawyer said. She believed you would be underestimated. I couldn't speak. I could barely breathe. All those years of being told not to expect anything suddenly made sense. They hadn't been protecting me. They had been preparing themselves when my family found out. The shift was immediate. Phones rang non-stop. Messages flooded in. Voices that had once been dismissive became gentle. People who had ignored me for years suddenly wanted to talk, to meet, to explain, to reconnect. They said there must be a mistake. They said my grandmother wouldn't have wanted this. They said we should handle it together as a family. I listened. I stayed calm. I said very little because for the first time in my life, I wasn't confused. I was clear. And that terrified them. They started reminding me of everything they had done for me, every favor, every moment of support. They framed generosity as debt, kindness as obligation, love as leverage. When I didn't give them what they wanted, the tone changed. Accusations replaced concern. Anger replaced affection. They said I was selfish, ungrateful, manipulated. They questioned my grandmother's judgment. They questioned mine. That's when the final truth came out. They had never planned to include me. Not now, not ever, and if my grandmother hadn't intervened, I would have been erased quietly, politely, with a smile. What they didn't know was that she had anticipated all of this. She had left instructions, safeguards, consequences. If anyone challenged the will, they would lose everything they expected to gain. She had protected me from guilt, from pressure, from manipulation. She knew exactly who they were. As I walked away from those conversations, I felt something I had never felt before. Peace. Not because I had money, but because I finally had truth. I didn't need to argue. I didn't need to prove anything. The silence that once kept me small now felt powerful. It belonged to me. And as I stepped into a future I hadn't been allowed to imagine before, I realized something that would stay with me forever. The quiet ones see everything. And sometimes they are the only ones who truly understand what justice looks like. This was only the beginning. After that first wave passed, after the calls slowed down and the messages stopped sounding polite, I thought the worst part was over. I believed that once the truth was out, once the will was clear, people would eventually accept it. I told myself that time would calm things down, that distance would soften the anger, that logic would win. That was another mistake. What I didn't understand yet was that for some people, losing control hurts more than losing money, and my family had just lost both. At first, they tried patience. They invited me over just to talk. They said they wanted closure. They said they wanted to understand my grandmother's decision. The words sounded reasonable, but the way they were delivered carried weight, like a test I was expected to pass. I went once thinking honesty might help, thinking that maybe deep down they wanted peace too. The moment I walked in, I felt it. The air was tight. Smiles were forced. Everyone was watching me, measuring me, like I had become a stranger overnight. I sat down, hands folded, saying nothing, waiting for someone to speak. They didn't ask how I was doing. They didn't ask how I was coping with grandma being gone. They went straight to the point. They said they felt hurt. They said they felt excluded. They said they felt betrayed. The irony almost made me laugh. But I kept my face neutral. I listened as they explained how unfair the situation was, how grandma must have been influenced, how a real family would share. When I didn't respond the way they wanted, when I didn't immediately agree to divide everything, the frustration started to show. Voices got sharper, words became heavier. They reminded me again and again of how much they had done for me growing up. As if love had been a loan I was now expected to repay with interest. I realized something important in that moment. They weren't talking to me, they were talking at me, trying different approaches, different angles, hoping one would crack me open. But I didn't crack. I stayed quiet, the same way I always had. Only this time, my silence wasn't fear, it was choice. When they saw that guilt wasn't working, they switched strategies. They started telling stories. Stories about grandma being confused in her later years, stories about how stressed she was, stories about how she didn't really understand the documents she signed. They said these things casually, like observations, but each word was placed carefully, meant to plant doubt in my mind. I felt my chest tighten, but not with uncertainty, with anger. They had spent years speaking for her, deciding for her, managing her life, and now that her decision didn't serve them, they were rewriting her memory too. I left that meeting early. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I simply stood up, said I needed time, and walked out. Behind me, I could hear voices rising, frustration spilling over. But I didn't turn back. That night, I couldn't sleep, not because I regretted anything, but because I finally saw the full picture. Every moment from my past started lining up. Every dismissal, every smile that felt wrong, every time I was told not to worry, not to ask, not to expect. It hadn't been kindness. It had been strategy. Over the next few weeks, things escalated. Not openly at first, quietly, subtly. I heard through mutual connections that people were talking, that questions were being asked about my character, that stories were circulating about how I had changed. Apparently, I was greedy now, cold, and grateful. It amazed me how quickly they rewrote reality, how easily they painted themselves as victims, how naturally they erased their own actions from the story. Then came the pressure from outside the family. Distant relatives I barely knew started reaching out. People who had never shown interest in my life suddenly wanted to check in. They framed their calls as concern. But the message underneath was always the same. Be careful, money destroys families. Do the right thing. Everyone had an opinion on what the right thing was. No one asked what I wanted. No one asked what Grandma wanted. They assumed they already knew. I started to understand why my grandmother had done everything in silence, why she had trusted paperwork more than people, why she had prepared for resistance instead of hoping for understanding. She knew. One afternoon, the lawyer called me again. He asked how I was holding up. I told him the truth, that it was harder than I expected, that the money wasn't the heavy part, the people were. He sighed, like this wasn't the first time he had seen a situation like mine. Your grandmother anticipated this phase, he said. That sentence stayed with me. He explained that after the will was read, after the initial shock, families often enter what he called the pressure stage. That's when manipulation intensifies. When guilt, fear, and public opinion are used as tools. She wanted you to know, he said, that none of this is accidental. He reminded me of the clause in the will, the one that protected me, the one that ensured anyone who tried to legally challenge the decision would lose everything they were hoping to gain. She trusted you to stay calm, he added. She trusted you not to react emotionally. I thought about all the years I had spent staying calm out of habit, out of survival. It felt strange realizing that the very trait that once made me invisible was now my shield. Not long after that, the threats began. Not physical, not obvious, but carefully worded warnings. Suggestions that things could get messy, that reputations could be damaged, that court battles were exhausting and expensive. They wanted me scared. They wanted me to fold quietly and hand things over just to make it stop. IDN single quotes T. Instead, I pulled back. I stopped answering calls that went nowhere. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped trying to make them understand something they never wanted to understand in the first place. That's when they made their boldest move. They decided to challenge the will. When I found out, I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was fear. Yes, the idea of a legal fight is intimidating for anyone. But underneath that fear was something else. Relief. Because now, everything was out in the open. They weren't pretending anymore. They were willing to accuse my grandmother, question her sanity, and drag her name through legal papers just to regain control. Any doubt I had left disappeared in that moment. The lawyer wasn't surprised. He told me this was exactly what she had predicted. He told me to trust the process, to let the safeguards she had put in place do their work. The weeks that followed were tense. I stayed mostly out of sight. I focused on my own stability. I reminded myself daily that standing firm didn't make me cruel. It made me honest. During the legal proceedings, truth surfaced that I had never been meant to hear. Emails, messages, conversations documented over years. Plans discussed behind closed doors, assumptions made about me, about my future, about my obedience. Reading those documents hurt more than any insult they had thrown at me directly, because they confirmed something painful. I had never been part of their plan. Not as an equal, not as a priority, not even as an afterthought. I was someone they assumed would comply, someone they believed would never push back. The case didn't last long. The evidence was clear. The safeguards worked exactly as intended. The challenge collapsed under its own weight. And just like that, the very act meant to take everything from me ended up costing them what they thought was already theirs. The aftermath was quiet. No apologies, no accountability, just distance. Some people stopped talking to me entirely. Others sent short, awkward messages, as if nothing had happened. I didn't chase anyone. I didn't demand explanations. I had spent enough of my life chasing approval. Instead, I focused on building something new, something steady, something honest. I invested carefully. I planned thoughtfully. I made choices based on peace, not pressure. Sometimes, late at night, I thought about my grandmother, about how lonely it must have been for her to see all of this coming, to know how things would unfold, to prepare in silence while smiling through family dinners. I understood her better now. Strength doesn't always look loud. Protection doesn't always look obvious. Love doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes, love works quietly, patiently, waiting for the right moment to speak. And when it finally does, it changes everything. As the noise faded and my life settled into something calmer, one truth became impossible to ignore. This wasn't just a story about money. It was a story about seeing clearly. And once you see clearly, you can never go back to pretending you don't. The hardest part was still ahead. Once the legal noise faded, I thought I would finally be able to breathe. I believed the hardest part had already passed, that the worst damage had been done, and that what remained would be quiet rebuilding. In many ways, I was right, but in one important way, I was very wrong. Because when people lose something they believe was always theirs, they don't always walk away. Sometimes they linger, sometimes they wait, and sometimes they look for other ways to take what they couldn't get directly. At first, the silence felt like relief. Days passed without calls. Weeks passed without messages. I started waking up without that tight feeling in my chest, without checking my phone first thing in the morning, bracing myself for another confrontation. I focused on practical things. I met with financial advisors. I learned words I had never needed before. I planned carefully, slowly, refusing to rush any decision. For the first time in my life, I was allowed to think long-term. That freedom felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, when you've spent years surviving one moment at a time. Planning for the future feels strange, like wearing clothes that don't quite fit yet, but I adjusted. I learned. I reminded myself that I didn't need to justify every choice I made. Still, something felt unfinished. It came to me in small ways. A mutual friend mentioning an odd comment, a distant relative asking questions that felt rehearsed, a sudden friendliness from people who had once ignored me completely. None of it was dramatic on its own, but together, it formed a pattern I couldn't ignore. They were watching, not openly, quietly. I realized then that, well, the legal battle was over. The emotional one was not. My family hadn't accepted the outcome. They had simply changed tactics. Instead of confronting me directly, they were shaping a narrative around me. A version of the story where they were wronged, where I was cold, where the inheritance had changed me. It hurt more than I expected, not because I cared about my reputation in a general sense, but because these were people who had known me my entire life, people who had watched me struggle, people who had benefited from my silence, and now they were using that same silence against me, filling it with their own version of events. For a while, I considered speaking up, explaining myself, correcting the lies, but every time I imagined doing it, I felt tired, deeply tired. I had spent so many years explaining myself already, shrinking myself so others could stay comfortable. I wasn't sure I had the energy to do it again, so I didn't. Instead, I turned inward. I started revisiting memories I had ignored before. Moments that hadn't made sense at the time, but now felt painfully clear. The way decisions were always framed as best for everyone. The way my needs were labeled as impractical. The way my independence was praised only when it meant they didn't have to support me. I saw it all differently now. It wasn't that they didn't care about me. It was that caring about me had never been convenient. That realization hurt. But it also freed me, because once you understand that someone's limitations are not your fault, you stop trying to earn what they were never willing to give. One evening, while sorting through some of my grandmother's old belongings, I found a small notebook tucked away in the back of a drawer. I almost missed it. It wasn't labeled. The cover was worn. Inside, her handwriting filled the pages. Neat but firm, she had written observations, not accusations. Not complaints, observations. She wrote about conversations she overheard, about moments that felt off, about things people said when they thought no one was listening. She never named anyone directly, but I knew exactly who she meant reading. Her words felt like sitting beside her again, listening quietly as she noticed what others pretended wasn't happening. One line stayed with me longer than the rest. They mistake her silence for agreement. I closed the notebook and sat there for a long time. That sentence explained my entire life. As the months passed, I began to change in ways I didn't expect. Not outwardly, I didn't become louder or more aggressive. But inside, something shifted. I stopped second-guessing my instincts. I stopped apologizing for boundaries. I stopped feeling responsible for other people's disappointment. That change didn't go unnoticed. Suddenly, I was described as distant, as different, as difficult. The truth was simpler. I was no longer available for manipulation. Then came the request that finally made everything clear. One afternoon, a family member I hadn't heard from in months asked to meet, not to talk about the past. They said, just to reconnect. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Part of me still hoped for something genuine, something human beneath all the tension. We met in a neutral place, public, calm, safe. At first, the conversation was polite, surface level. They asked about my life. I answered briefly, then slowly, carefully. They steered the conversation where I knew it would go. They talked about how hard things had been, how much stress everyone was under, how mistakes were made, but intentions were good. They said no one wanted conflict, that all anyone wanted was fairness. Then they made the suggestion, not a demand, a suggestion, that I help out, that I support certain family needs, that I contribute. Quietly, generously, without making it official, they framed it as healing, as moving forward. As being the bigger person, I listened, I nodded, I let them finish, and then I said no, not angrily, not defensively, just no. The reaction was instant. Their expression changed. The softness disappeared. For a moment, I saw exactly what I had been dealing with all along: the entitlement, the expectation, the belief that my role was to give, and theirs was to decide how much was enough. They accused me of holding grudges, of punishing everyone for the actions of a few. They said I was letting money define me. I didn't argue. I simply said, I'm not responsible for fixing something I didn't break. That was the end of the conversation. After that, the attempts stopped, the watching continued, but the reach didn't. I think they finally understood that the version of me they relied on was gone. The quiet compliance, the easy guilt, the automatic yes. It was strange mourning people who were still alive, mourning relationships that had never really existed in the way I thought they did. There were days when the loss hit me harder than the betrayal itself. But slowly, something else grew in that empty space: clarity. I began to build a life that reflected who I actually was, not who others needed me to be. I chose calm over chaos, stability over approval, honesty over harmony, and in the quiet, Moments when I thought about my grandmother, I didn't feel sadness as sharply anymore. I felt gratitude. Gratitude that she had seen me. Gratitude that she had trusted me. Gratitude that she had given me more than money. She had given me permission. Permission to stop disappearing. Permission to stop explaining. Permission to stand. Still, even when others wanted me to move for their comfort, I knew then that this story wasn't finished yet, not because there was more conflict coming, but because the meaning of what had happened was still unfolding. And the deeper I stepped into my own life, the more I understood just how deliberate her final gift had been. She hadn't just changed my future, she had changed how I saw myself. And once that changes, nothing ever goes back to the way it was. After that last meeting, after the quiet but unmistakable line had finally been drawn, something unexpected happened. The tension that had followed me for months began to loosen its grip. Not all at once, and not completely, but enough for me to notice the difference. I wasn't waking up braced for impact anymore. I wasn't rehearsing conversations in my head that I hoped would never happen. The constant alertness, the feeling that I had to be ready to defend myself at any moment, slowly started to fade. In its place came something unfamiliar. Stillness. At first, that stillness felt empty, almost dangerous. When you've lived your whole life reacting to other people's moods and expectations, quiet can feel like something is missing. I caught myself waiting for the next problem, the next message, the next accusation. But days passed and nothing came. Weeks passed and the world didn't fall apart. That's when I realized how much of my energy had been spent managing other people's emotions. I had always believed that if I stayed reasonable enough, calm enough, accommodating enough, things would eventually settle. I had taken on responsibility for harmony that was never mine to begin with. Letting go of that role felt like stepping out of a room I hadn't realized I was locked inside. With the noise gone, memories resurfaced in a different way. Not the sharp, painful kind, but the quieter ones. Moments with my grandmother that I had overlooked before. Small gestures, small looks, the way she would squeeze my hand twice instead of once, as if to say more than words could. The way she would change the subject whenever someone started speaking for me. I began to understand that her silence had never been passive. It had been strategic. She hadn't argued because she knew arguing wouldn't change them. She hadn't confronted because she knew confrontation would only make them hide better. Instead, she observed, she listened, she documented, she waited. And when the time was right, she acted. That understanding changed how I viewed everything that had happened. What I once thought of as a sudden twist now felt like the final chapter of a very long plan, one that had been unfolding quietly while everyone else assumed they were in control. As I settled into my new reality, I became more aware of how differently people treated me now. Some were cautious, unsure of how to approach me. Others were overly polite, as if trying to rewrite the past through exaggerated kindness. A few avoided me entirely, unable or unwilling to reconcile their version of me with the one standing in front of them. I didn't correct anyone. For the first time, I understood that I didn't owe people access to me just because they were curious. I didn't owe explanations just because they felt entitled to them. My life was no longer a group project. That shift brought unexpected confidence, not the loud, performative kind, but a steady sense of grounding. I made decisions without consulting everyone. I trusted my instincts without needing approval. I learned to sit with discomfort instead of rushing to resolve it for someone else's sake. There were moments when guilt tried to creep back in. Old habits don't disappear easily. I would catch myself wondering if I was being too cold, too distant, too firm. In those moments, I returned to the notebook my grandmother had left behind. I reread her observations. I reminded myself that boundaries are not punishments, they are protections. One entry stood out more than the rest. Kindness without limits teaches people they can take without consequence. I closed the notebook and let that truth settle. Around that time, something else began to happen. People outside the family started responding to me differently. Colleagues, acquaintances, Even strangers seemed to sense the change. Conversations felt more balanced. Respect came more easily. It was subtle, but undeniable. I realized then that the way I had been treated before wasn't just about my family. It was about the role I had accepted. When you teach people that your needs come last, they learn to believe it, and learning that took time. I started small, saying no when something didn't feel right. Taking breaks without explaining myself. Letting silence sit in conversations instead of rushing to fill it. Each small act felt rebellious at first, like I was breaking an unspoken rule. But with every step, the fear lessened, and in that growing confidence, I began to feel something else. Grief, not just for my grandmother, but for the version of myself that had spent so long believing she had to earn her place. I mourned the years I had minimized my voice, the opportunities I had passed up because I didn't think I deserved more. I allowed myself to feel that sadness without turning it into blame. Healing, I learned, isn't about pretending things didn't hurt. It's about acknowledging the hurt without letting it define you. There were moments when I wondered if my family felt any regret, if they ever questioned their choices, if they ever thought about how close they came to losing me completely. But those questions slowly lost their urgency. Whether they understood or not stopped mattering. What mattered was that I understood. I understood that my grandmother's final gift wasn't just protection from financial harm. It was protection from a lifetime of manipulation. She had stepped in where no one else would. She had validated what I had felt but couldn't prove for so long. She had believed me, even when I didn't fully believe myself. As the months turned into a year, my life took shape in ways I hadn't planned but deeply appreciated. Stability replaced anxiety. Choice replaced obligation. I built routines that nourished me instead of draining me. I surrounded myself with people who listened, who respected silence as much as words. Sometimes, in quieter moments, I imagined what my grandmother would say if she could see me now. I imagined her calm smile, her steady gaze. I imagined her saying nothing at all, just nodding slightly, as if to say she knew this would happen, because she always did. There was one final encounter that brought everything full circle. It happened unexpectedly in a place I didn't associate with family or conflict. A chance meeting, brief, awkward, polite. We exchanged a few words about neutral things, weather, time, life, moving on. At the end of the conversation, there was a pause. A moment where something unsaid hovered between us. An apology, maybe, or an acknowledgement. But it never came, and for the first time, I didn't feel disappointed. I realized then that closure doesn't always come from others. Sometimes it comes from deciding that you no longer need anything from the people who hurt you. Sometimes it comes from accepting that understanding may never be mutual, and choosing peace anyway. As I walked away, I felt lighter than I expected, not because everything had been resolved, but because I no longer needed to prove my worth through sacrifice. I no longer needed to justify my existence through usefulness. I was allowed to take up space quietly, confidently, without permission. That was the true inheritance. And as I moved forward, carrying my grandmother's lessons with me, I understood that her story didn't end with her passing. It continued. Through the choices I made, the boundaries I held, and the lies I refused to shrink. There was still one last chapter left to tell. Not about conflict or confrontation, but about meaning, about what remains after betrayal has done its worst. And what grows when you finally choose yourself. Asterisk, by the time I realized, I was no longer waiting for anything to happen. I understood how deeply my life had changed. There was no countdown in my head anymore, no quiet tension preparing me for the next disruption. The absence of chaos had become normal. And that alone felt like a victory I hadn't known I was fighting for. I began to notice how differently my days moved now. Mornings felt slower, fuller. I made decisions based on what I needed, not on how they would be received. There was a calm confidence in choosing myself that didn't require explanation. For the first time, my energy belonged to me. That didn't mean the past disappeared. It lingered in small ways, Certain phrases still triggered a tightness in my chest. Certain situations reminded me of how easily I used to retreat, but now, instead of freezing or shrinking, I paused, I breathed, I chose. That choice changed everything. I started speaking more honestly, not louder, but clearer. I stopped cushioning my words to protect people who had never protected me. I didn't become harsh. I became direct, and the difference was powerful. Some people adjusted, others drifted away. I let both happen. There was a moment one evening, sitting alone in my home, when it finally hit me just how far I had come. Not in terms of comfort or security, but in self-respect. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who learned early that staying quiet made life easier for everyone else. I wished I could reach back through time and tell her that ease isn't the same as peace. Peace comes from alignment, from living in a way that doesn't require you to disappear. I thought about my grandmother often during those moments. I imagined her watching from somewhere quiet, not with pride in a dramatic sense, but with that calm satisfaction she always carried, the kind that doesn't need recognition, the kind that simply knows. I understood now why she had never tried to change anyone, why she had never fought loudly or demanded fairness. She knew something I was only beginning to grasp. You don't win by forcing people to become better. You win by protecting what matters and letting others reveal who they are. In the months that followed, I used my resources carefully, intentionally. Not to prove anything, not to show success, but to create stability. I invested in learning, in growth, in experiences that expanded me instead of tying me down. Every decision felt like a quiet act of self-trust, and slowly, something unexpected happened. I stopped defining my story by what was taken from me. The betrayal no longer sat at the center of my identity. It became part of my history, not the headline. When people asked about my family, I answered simply. I didn't explain. I didn't defend. I didn't relive the pain for their curiosity. I had moved on. That shift didn't come from forgiveness in the way people like to talk about it. It came from acceptance. Acceptance that some people will never see you clearly, no matter how much you give. Acceptance that love without respect is not something you need to preserve. Acceptance that walking away can be an act of strength, not failure. There were days when I wondered if my family ever reflected on what happened, if they recognized the patterns they repeated, if they understood what they lost beyond money. But those questions grew quieter over time, until they barely registered at all, because the truth was simple. I didn't need their understanding to live well. I had my own. As my life settled into something steady and grounded, I realized that my grandmother's gift had extended far beyond protection. She had disrupted a cycle of silence, of assumption, of entitlement. She had forced the truth into the open, even if it made people uncomfortable. And in doing so, she had given me something rare. Freedom without guilt. I could choose my future without dragging the past behind me. I could build relationships based on mutual respect instead of obligation. I could exist without constantly proving my value. That freedom reshaped how I saw the world. I became more attentive, more discerning. I noticed dynamics I had once ignored. I recognized when people expected me to shrink, and I didn't. I recognized when kindness was genuine, and I allowed it in. The most surprising part was how natural it all began to feel. This wasn't a transformation that happened overnight. It was gradual, quiet, almost invisible from the outside. But inside, everything was different. I was no longer surviving. I was living with intention. One afternoon, as I revisited my grandmother's notebook one last time, I found a page I hadn't noticed before. It was short, only a few lines. Strength doesn't need permission, truth doesn't rush, and those who wait quietly often see the clearest. I closed the notebook and smiled. For the first time, I felt complete, not because everything had been resolved, but because nothing was unresolved within me. The anger had softened. The sadness had settled. What remained was clarity. I understood now that justice doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like continuation, like choosing to live fully, honestly, and freely in a way that honors the truth without being consumed by it. I carried that understanding with me as I moved forward, aware that my story would always include loss, but no longer defined by it. The betrayal had shaped me, yes, but it had not broken me. And the legacy my grandmother left behind wasn't measured in numbers or assets. It lived in every choice I made that honored my voice, my boundaries, and my worth. There was one final realization waiting for me. One that would bring everything into focus, not about them, about me. And what it truly means to rise quietly, without apology, into the life you were always meant to live. The last realization didn't arrive with drama or intensity. It came softly, almost unnoticed. During an ordinary moment, I was standing by a window one evening, watching the city settle into itself, lights flickering on one by one, people moving through their lives without knowing anything about mine. And suddenly, I understood something that changed the way I viewed everything that had happened. I had spent so much time thinking about betrayal, about justice, about what was taken and what was protected, that I hadn't fully acknowledged the most important shift of all. I was no longer living in reaction. For years, my choices had been shaped by other people's expectations. Even when I believed I was being independent, I was still responding to invisible pressure. I was still measuring myself against standards I didn't create. I was still adjusting, adapting, staying careful. Now, that framework was gone. There was no one left to impress, no one left to convince, no one left to appease. And in that freedom, I finally met myself. I realized that the quiet strength my grandmother saw in me wasn't something that appeared because of the inheritance. It had always been there. It was the reason she trusted me. It was the reason she chose silence over confrontation and preparation over persuasion. She didn't leave me money because she felt sorry for me. She left it because she believed in me. That distinction mattered more than anything else. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel proud, not in a loud or showy way, but in a grounded, steady way. Proud that I had endured without becoming bitter. Proud that I had stood firm without becoming cruel. Proud that I had chosen clarity over chaos, even when chaos would have been easier. I thought about how differently this story could have ended if my grandmother hadn't acted. If I had stayed silent out of fear instead of choice, if I had folded under pressure just to keep the peace, the outcome would have looked calm on the surface and hollow underneath. I would have continued shrinking, continued disappearing, continued believing that my role was to accept less so others could have more. That future no longer belonged to me. Instead, I was building a life that felt honest, one where my needs mattered, one where my voice didn't feel like an inconvenience, one where love was measured by respect, not obligation. I understood now that betrayal doesn't always come from cruelty. Sometimes it comes from comfort, from people getting used to benefiting from your silence, from systems that work because one person never pushes back. Breaking that pattern will always upset those who rely on it, and that's okay. The hardest lesson I learned was that being misunderstood is sometimes the price of being free. That not everyone will applaud your growth, especially if it exposes their behavior. That walking away without explanation can be healthier than staying to defend yourself endlessly. I used to think closure came from conversations, from apologies, from acknowledgement. Now I know better. Closure comes from alignment, from knowing who you are and acting accordingly, even when no one else agrees. From trusting yourself enough to move forward without dragging old wounds behind you. As time went on, the story of what happened became quieter in my mind, not forgotten, but settled. It no longer demanded attention. It no longer defined my days. It existed as a reminder, not a weight, a reminder that silence can be strength, a reminder that observation can be power, a reminder that being underestimated can be an advantage. Most of all, it reminded me that the people who truly love you don't need to control you to feel secure. They don't fear your independence. They don't diminish your voice to protect Their comfort. My grandmother knew that. She saw me clearly when others didn't. She trusted me when others dismissed me. And in doing so, she changed the course of my life in a way that went far beyond material security. Her legacy lives on in how I move through the world now. Calm, intentional, unapologetic. I don't rush. I don't over-explain. I don't disappear. I exist fully, quietly, and on my own terms. And if there's one thing this entire experience taught me, it's this. You don't need to be loud to be powerful. You don't need permission to protect yourself. And you don't owe anyone access to a life you worked hard to reclaim. Sometimes, the greatest form of justice isn't confrontation. It's continuation. It's living well. It's living honestly. It's living free. And that is the inheritance that no one can ever take from me.